Someone in that room wanted him dead. He just didn't know it yet. The Grand Meridian Hotel in Washington, D.C. was the kind of place where power didn't announce itself. It didn't have to. It moved through the room the way expensive cologne moves through a crowd. Invisible, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Crystal chandeliers threw light across 300 guests in evening wear. Senators laughed too loudly. Business deals were made over handshakes that would never appear in any contract. And at the center table, the way a sun sits at the center of everything that orbits it, sat Elijah Voss. 44 years old, built from discipline and controlled energy and 18 years of decisions that had made him one of the most powerful private equity figures on the East Coast. The kind of man whose name made rooms go quiet before he entered them. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His presence was its own announcement. His wife, Serena, sat beside him in a gown the color of champagne, her hand resting on his arm with the practiced ease of a woman who had performed this exact role for 9 years. Graceful, attentive, perfectly placed. She laughed at the right moments. She leaned in at the right moments. She was by every visible measure exactly where she wanted to be. She was lying, but Elijah didn't know that yet. What he knew was that his throat had started to tighten 40 minutes after the first course arrived. Subtle at first, the kind of discomfort you dismiss, chalk it up to the room being too warm, the tie too tight, the evening too long. He reached for his water glass. His hand felt heavier than it should. He set it down, reached for it again. The tightening moved deeper. Not his throat now, his chest, the specific, narrowing pressure of a body beginning to betray itself in a room full of people who would notice if it did. He had a severe allergy to shellfish. He had carried that knowledge since childhood, managed it with the same precision he managed everything else in his life. He had not ordered shellfish. He had been careful. He was always careful. And yet, his eyes moved to the plate in front of him, then to the kitchen entrance across the ballroom, then, without planning to the face of his wife. Serena was speaking to the man on her left, animated, smiling, not looking at Elijah. Something moved through him that he didn't have language for yet. Not suspicion, not accusation, just a feeling, small and cold, and sitting exactly at the base of his sternum. He pressed it down. He was being paranoid. He picked up his water glass again, and that was when a woman appeared at his left shoulder. Not his usual server. Younger, dark natural hair pulled back. The kind of face that was easy to underestimate until you looked at her eyes. And her eyes were doing something no one else's in this room were doing. They were looking directly at him. Not at his title, not at his table, at him, specifically, with the focused, quiet attention of someone who had already seen something everyone else had missed. She leaned in close enough that only he could hear her and said, in a voice so steady it felt like a hand placed on a shoulder, "I can see what's happening to you. I have what you need, but you have to trust me right now." He looked at her. He had spent 18 years reading people for a living. In half a second, he read her. No agenda. No performance. Just truth. "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who's going to keep you alive," she said. "If you let me." And in that moment, this powerful man, this controlled and careful and untouchable man, made the only decision that mattered. He nodded. If you've never watched a story that made you feel everything all at once, you're about to. Her name was Naomi Clark, 29 years old, 4 years working hotel events in Washington, D.C. because the hours were long and the tips were honest, and the work left her mind free enough to study for the nursing boards she had been chipping away since her mother got sick 3 years ago. She noticed things. It was not a skill she had cultivated consciously. It was something that had grown in her the way any survival tool grows, out of necessity. She had grown up in a household where the difference between a good night and a dangerous one was visible in the set of a jaw, the angle of a shoulder, the specific way someone's hands went still when they were managing something they weren't going to say out loud. She had learned to read bodies before she could name what she was reading. So when she saw Elijah Voss at table 7, she didn't see a name or a net worth or a reputation. She saw a man whose jaw was 3 degrees too tight, whose blink rate had increased in the last 4 minutes, whose right hand had reached for his water glass and come back to the table twice without drinking. She had seen these signs before, once on her mother, once on a guest at a corporate dinner in Connecticut 18 months ago who had gone into anaphylaxis in the men's restroom and survived only because Naomi had already called the paramedics before anyone else registered something was wrong. She moved toward him without second-guessing herself. That was the thing about having good instincts. You didn't always get the luxury of confirming them before you had to act on them. She carried an epinephrine auto-injector in the small emergency kit. She kept in her server's apron alongside the aspirin and the antiseptic wipes and the folded piece of paper with the 3 emergency numbers her supervisor had told her she would never need. She had needed every one of them. What she had not expected, what she would think about for a long time afterward, was the way Elijah Voss looked at her when she leaned in. She had expected resistance. She had expected the instinctive recoil of a powerful man being approached by someone from the service staff at a gala. She had prepared for the 2-second conversation she would have to win before he would let her help him. He didn't give her that conversation. He read her in the time it took most people to decide whether to make eye contact. And then he said yes. She guided him out of the ballroom through the service corridor, the long, narrow hallway behind the kitchen that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and warm bread, where no one from the main room could see them. She made him sit on an equipment case against the wall. She administered the injection with hands that didn't shake. She watched his face. 30 seconds. 60. The color began to return to his jaw, the line between his brows softening incrementally as the constriction in his chest began to release its grip. He breathed, really breathed, not the controlled, managed breathing of a man holding himself together. The deep involuntary breath of a body deciding at the last possible moment to continue. He looked at her. "You knew," he said. "Ow, I watch people," she said simply. "It's what I do." He was quiet for a moment. The sound of the ballroom continued distantly. Music, laughter, 300 people having no idea what had just happened 15 feet away from them. "What's your name?" "Naomi. Naomi." He repeated it like he was memorizing it. "You just saved my life." "I know," she said. And the fact that she didn't dress it up, didn't reach for modesty or deflection or any of the social softening that most people would have instinctively reached for, did something to him that he wasn't prepared for. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere more important to be. "The food was modified," he said quietly. Not a question. He had already arrived at the answer on his own in the space of the last 4 minutes. "Someone in that room put shellfish in my plate, knowing I am severely allergic." She said nothing, because she had already thought the same thing and knew there was nothing to say to it that would make it smaller. "It wasn't an accident," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere in the ballroom, someone began to applaud. The sound floated through the wall and landed in the space between them like something from a different world entirely. Because it was what Naomi didn't say, what she had seen from across the room before she moved toward him, was this. She had watched Serena Voss turn her head and look toward the kitchen exactly twice during the first course. Not at her husband, at the kitchen, with the specific, brief attentiveness of someone checking on something they were expecting. Naomi had noticed it the way she noticed everything. She filed it. She said nothing, but she knew, and that knowledge was about to change everything. They were in a black car within 20 minutes. Naomi had not planned this. She had planned nothing past the corridor, past the injection, past the moment his breathing steadied and the color came back to his face. But two things happened in rapid succession that made planning irrelevant. First, Elijah's head of security, a composed and enormous man named Marcus Webb, appeared in the service corridor within 4 minutes of the event with the specific, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been monitoring the situation from the moment Elijah left the table. He looked at Naomi. The estate an hour north of New York was the kind of place that existed specifically to be forgotten by the outside world. Stone walls, iron gates, grounds that absorbed sound. Naomi stood in the center of a guest room larger than her entire apartment in Washington, D.C., and held herself very still. Not because she was frightened, because she was trying to locate the thread of herself that connected to the life she had woken up inside this morning. The nursing exam flashcards on her kitchen table, the shift schedule pinned to the refrigerator, the younger sister Cora, who was a college sophomore in New Haven, Connecticut, who called every Sunday at 7 and would call this Sunday and find the phone going to voicemail. She had not given anyone Cora's name. She had not given anyone anything. 30 minutes later, Elijah appeared in the doorway. Changed. The evening were replaced by something simpler. Dark trousers, a gray shirt, the sleeves pushed to the elbow. He looked, without the architecture of the gala around him, like a different version of himself. Still precise, still contained, but stripped of the performance of it. Something underneath that was just a man. He held the phone toward her. Your sister received a grocery delivery 40 minutes ago. She also has a security detail. She will not notice it. Naomi stared at him. She had not mentioned Cora. She had not mentioned anything. You had me checked, she said. In the car, he said. I know that feels like an intrusion. It was. Yes, he agreed. No apology for the action, only for the necessity. And the thing that should have made her angrier, the thing that moved through her chest instead with a warmth she was not ready to examine, was that his first instinct, before his own situation was resolved, before his own next move was decided, had been to make sure her family was safe. Sit down, Naomi, he said. She sat. He sat across from her at the small table near the window, and Marcus entered behind him and set a laptop open between them. The footage was from the hotel's kitchen security system. Marcus had pulled in the car. It ran for 40 seconds. A sous chef at Station 3, visible clearly in the timestamp, adding a prepared sauce to a specific plate. One plate, not the others at the table, from a separate container that had not been part of the original mise en place. The sous chef's name was Vincent. He had worked at the Grand Meridian for 3 years. His employment had been sponsored initially through a hospitality grant from a private foundation. A foundation, Marcus said quietly, that was registered to a holding company. A holding company that had been incorporated 9 years ago in California by a woman named Serena Voss. Elijah sat completely still. The room was very quiet. Outside, the estate grounds held the specific silence of a space designed to contain things. Naomi watched his face and did not speak, because she understood, from years of watching people absorb the unbearable, that this kind of silence needed to be sat inside fully before anything else was possible. He had not loved Serena carelessly. That was what made this so devastating to watch. This was not the pain of a man who had been foolish. This was the pain of a man who had been thorough, who had built his entire capacity for trust around one person and constructed his life on top of it, discovering that the foundation had been designed to fail. How long? He asked Marcus. Marcus didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. The foundation was active 18 months after the wedding. Marcus said. Elijah absorbed this. 7.5 years. She had spent 7.5 years building the architecture of this. Not in a rage, not in a moment of desperation. Impatience. in quiet and deliberate patience, the way you build something you intend to last. He stood, walked to the window, stood with his back to the room and his hand on the glass, and said nothing. Naomi looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, at the specific posture of a man who has just had the floor taken out from beneath him and is standing anyway through the simple refusal to do anything else. She stood up. She crossed the room. She didn't touch him. She stood beside him at the window, close enough that her arm was almost against his, far enough that he had the choice. Outside, the grounds were dark and still and enormous. The sky above them held more stars than were visible from the city. After a long time, he said, "I don't know how to do this." She looked at the window, at both of their reflections in the glass, side by side in the dark room, the estate grounds behind them, the strange and complete intimacy of two people standing in the aftermath of something enormous. "You don't have to know how," she said. "Not tonight." He turned his head and looked at her. She looked back, and in the quiet of that room, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with a declaration, just the slow, irreversible shift of two people who have been through enough together in a short time that something has been built between them that neither of them asked for. He didn't look away. Neither did she. And what Marcus found the next morning was going to make everything more complicated, and more dangerous, and more important than either of them were ready for. For days past, Naomi had expected them to feel like containment. They didn't. Elijah Voss was not what she had constructed in her mind from the evidence of the ballroom, the untouchable, orbited center of a room full of powerful people. He was present in a way she had not anticipated. He worked at the dining room table with the focus of someone who had never learned to be idle. He read in the library, actual reading, not performing it. He moved through his own house the way someone moves through a space they have decided to actually inhabit rather than simply maintain. On the second morning, she came downstairs before 6, unable to sleep, her mind cycling through the nursing board question sets she had been running through her head as a way of holding onto the life that existed outside this week. He was already in the kitchen, standing at the window with a mug in both hands, watching the early October light begin at the edges of the New York horizon. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. He simply reached for a second mug and filled it without being asked and set on the counter beside him. She picked it up. They stood at the window without speaking and watched the morning arrive. It was the most honest 20 minutes she had spent with another person in longer than she could calculate. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she said eventually. He didn't ask what she meant. "Every day," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That's not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? That you'd tell me you love it, that it's who you are, that you can't imagine anything else." He turned his head and looked at her. "Those things are also true," he said. "They don't cancel each other out." She looked back at the window. "No," she said. "I suppose they don't." On the third afternoon, she found a box outside her door. Inside, 4 nursing board preparation volumes, current edition, with the relevant chapters already bookmarked with adhesive tabs in 3 colors. The kind of organization that took time. Attention. The decision to pay attention. She brought them downstairs. He was at his desk. She set them on the corner of it without preamble. "You went into my things," she said. "Your bag was open on the kitchen chair," he said. "I saw the flashcards. So you bought the books. I found what you were studying and got what you needed. Those aren't the same thing." "No," she agreed. "They're not. You could have asked." He met her eyes, held them. "Yes," he said. "I could have." A pause. "I'm better at finding than asking." She studied him. The way he said it, not as an excuse, but as a fact about himself, offered plainly, without defense, landed differently than she expected. She sat down across from his desk. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because asking requires a belief that someone will stay long enough for the answer to matter," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm still here," she said. Something moved through his expression. Quick and unguarded, the kind of thing a man shows when he doesn't have time to manage it. He looked at the desk, then back at her. "I know," he said, quietly, like it meant something specific. That evening, Marcus knocked on the study door. Naomi, passing in the hallway, caught the expression on his face before the door swung shut. She had seen that expression on doctors delivering news that changed the direction of everything. She stopped walking. She waited. She heard Elijah say a name in a voice like something tearing. And she understood, without hearing another word, that what was coming was going to require everything both of them had. Because it wasn't just Serena. It had never been just Serena. There was someone else. Someone closer. Someone Elijah had trusted longer than his marriage. And that person was already on their way to the estate. His name was Daniel Voss, Elijah's younger brother by 4 years. Yale Law, easy charm, the kind of man who made you feel like the most interesting person in the room because he had spent 30 years practicing the art of making people feel exactly that. Naomi had met him briefly on day 3. He had arrived at the estate unannounced with the specific, unhurried ease of a man who had never needed to be announced anywhere, and had stayed for 2 hours, asked careful questions under the language of concern, and left. She had felt something wrong about him immediately. The specific quality of his listening, too precise, too deliberate, tracking things that a worried brother would not have thought to track. She had said nothing. She wished now she had. Marcus laid it out completely at the dining room table with Elijah and Naomi both present, because by this point there was no version of the conversation that excluded her, and Elijah had stopped pretending there was. Daniel had been building a parallel position within Elijah's firm for 3 years. Systematically, patiently, using access that Elijah had given him freely, because he was family, because family meant something, because 18 years of building something from nothing had never once made Elijah forget where he had come from or who had been standing beside him at the beginning. Serena and Daniel had been coordinating for 22 months. The plan was not impulsive. It was constructed. The poisoning was designed to trigger a power of attorney clause that Elijah had signed at Daniel's recommendation 4 years ago. A clause that, in the event of Elijah's incapacitation or death, transferred operational control of the firm to the next of kin, his wife, with Daniel as the designated managing partner. All of it legal, all of it clean, all of it built from the inside, using the specific trust of a man who had given everything to the people he loved and expected nothing back except their presence. Elijah listened to all of it without moving. When Marcus finished, the room was completely silent. Naomi sat across from Elijah and did not offer words, did not reach for anything to fill the silence with, because some truths needed the full weight of the room before anything else could happen. After a long time, he looked at her. "How do you go on from this?" he said. It was the same question she had heard from people sitting in hospital waiting rooms. People who had just received the kind of news that rewrites the entire story of their life in a single sentence. She had never had a clean answer to it. She still didn't. "You go on the way anyone goes on," she said. "You choose what's next instead of what was." He held her gaze. "What's next?" he repeated. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he stood, and what happened in the next 24 hours was the most precise, most controlled, and most devastating piece of work Elijah Voss had ever done in 18 years of building things. And this time he was taking something apart. He walked into his firm's New York offices at 7 in the morning with Marcus and 2 attorneys and a forensic accountant who had been working through the night. He did not call ahead. He did not give warning. He walked through the glass doors of the building he had built with a steadiness that the receptionist would later describe as the calmest she had ever seen a person be on the worst day of their life. Serena was in the boardroom. Daniel was beside her. Documents spread across the table. The same documents Elijah had signed in good faith over 4 years, annotated now in the margins with Daniel's handwriting. The administrative infrastructure of a takeover that had been running in the walls of everything Elijah had built. Elijah stood at the head of the table. He looked at his brother first. He didn't speak immediately. He had always believed that the most important things deserved to be said slowly, because slow was the only pace at which another person could truly hear you. "I taught you everything," he said, quietly, without performance. "I gave you everything I learned. Every contact, every door I opened, every room I brought you into when you had no reason to be there except that you were my blood, and I believe that mattered." Daniel said nothing. His hands were flat on the table, and he was not looking up. "You used everything I ever gave you to take everything from me," Elijah said. "And I want you to understand, not with anger, with grief, that the man who trusted you died in that hotel corridor. He doesn't exist anymore. And the person standing here now does not carry what he carried." He turned to Serena. She was already crying. He looked at the tears, then at her eyes, and something in his face made it clear, quietly, unmistakably, that he had seen her cry before. Many times, had believed every tear. "Not anymore. The divorce papers are on the table," he said. "You'll sign them now." She did, with shaking hands. He looked at Marcus. One look, the language of two men who had worked beside each other long enough that words had become optional. Marcus nodded, and Elijah turned away and did not look back. He walked out of the boardroom and down the corridor to the elevator and stood in the quiet of it as the doors closed. And for the first time since the Grand Meridian, with no one watching and no reason to hold anything together, he stood in the silence of his own reflection in the elevator's mirrored wall. And let it cost him what it cost him. Naomi was at the estate when he returned. She was in the kitchen, the nursing board books open on the table, a cup of tea cooling beside her hand, Cora's voice on the speakerphone talking about a film she had seen in New Haven. She looked up when he walked in. He looked at her, just looked, the way he had not allowed himself to look at anything since the hotel. She said goodnight to Cora, set the phone down. He crossed the kitchen and sat across from her at the table, and for a long moment said nothing. She waited, because she had learned in 4 days of watching this man that he needed a moment to arrive at the thing he actually meant to say. "I have never in my life," he said finally, "met someone who walked toward me without knowing what I was worth." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't walk toward you because of what you were worth," she said. "I walked toward you because you needed someone to—" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, not grabbing, not claiming, just an open hand, palm up. A question. She looked at it. She thought about the flashcards on her kitchen table in Washington, the shift schedule on the refrigerator, the nursing boards in 6 weeks, the life she had carefully, quietly built for herself out of the years that had been hard and the years that had been harder. She thought about all of it, and she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers gently, the way you hold something you have decided to protect rather than possess. "I want to ask," he said, quietly, "before I do anything. From now on, I want to ask." She felt the laugh rise before she could stop it, real and unplanned and completely surprised. He looked at her when she laughed like it was the most valuable thing he had witnessed in longer than he could measure. She was still holding his hand. She didn't let go. Outside, the October sky over New York was just beginning to lighten at its edges, the specific pale gold of a morning that had decided to begin. Cora was safe. The threat was finished. And at a kitchen table in an estate north of the city, a woman who had walked toward a stranger in a hotel corridor because it was the right thing to do, and a man who had spent 18 years building a world that had been quietly dismantled from the inside, sat together in the new quiet of everything that came after. Not as two people who had survived something, as two people choosing what came next. Together, And for the first time in a very long time, for both of them, that felt like enough. It felt like everything. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something you weren't expecting, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me the moment that got you. And if you want to know what happens when two people choose each other in the aftermath of everything, hit the bell. We're just getting started.